Can a nation lose its land and resources without a single bullet being fired? For Ugandan President Yoweri Museveni, the answer lies in the subtle erasure of identity. You see, throughout his long tenure, Museveni has repeatedly warned that when an indigenous population abandons its historic cultural identity in favor of foreign hegemony, whether Western or Eastern, it renders itself vulnerable to dispossession. If you're getting any value, kindly do well to hit the like, share and subscribe button. At the heart of Museveni's Pan-African philosophy is a stark warning against ideological submission. He argues that under the guise of religious expansion or ideological conversion, specifically pointing to historical Islamization agendas, lies a deeper geopolitical objective: the alignment of African territories with external interests, such as foreign or Arab oligarchies. In this vision, erasing an indigenous people's heritage, language, and ancestral memory breaks their historic tie to the soil, paving the way for economic dominance and the extraction of vital resources. To illustrate this dynamic, ladies and gentlemen, Museveni frequently points to former Sudanese President Omar al-Bashir as a prime case study. Under Bashir's rule, the regime in Khartoum attempted to enforce a rigid policy of Arabization and Islamization over a profoundly diverse population, particularly in the south and western periphery. Museveni argued that Bashir's policy were not merely about faith, but represented an assertion of cultural superiority that treated black indigenous Africans as second-class citizens within their own homeland. Instead of building a unified multicultural nation, this aggressive imposition tore Sudan apart, fueling decades of civil war, economic ruin, and the eventual secession of South Sudan. For Museveni, the lessons from Sudan serve as a persistent reminder for the rest of the continent. Faith and spirituality must never be weaponized to destroy African identity or surrender economic sovereignty. True independence requires Africans to safeguard their cultural heritage, understand their history, and maintain firm control over their own lands and resources. Because when identity is erased, ladies and gentlemen, ownership soon follows. Now, I'm going to give you historical instances of land dispossession via Islamization. Let's start with Egypt. The mechanism used was the jizya, that's the tax on non-Muslims, and dhimmi status. The historical impact was that following the 7th century Arab conquest, the indigenous Coptic population was subjected to the jizya tax and land administration reforms. Over centuries of Umayyad, Abbasid, and Mamluk rule, severe financial pressures and intermittent land confiscations triggered widespread revolts, such as the Bashmurian revolts in the Nile Delta. The outcome was that when local populations could no longer afford the punitive taxation required to retain their ancestral holdings, many converted or abandoned their agricultural estates. Over time, land ownership transferred predominantly to Arab military elites and state trusts, fundamentally altering the demographic and economic structure of Egypt. Next is Sudan. The mechanism used was the Bakht Treaty, the Funj or Darfur Sultanate, and modern state-enforced Arabization. Now, the historical impact of that was that beginning with the 7th century Bakht Treaty with Nubia, Arab migration gradually eroded indigenous Christian Nubian kingdoms through intermarriage, trade dominance, and land acquisition along the Nile Valley. By the 20th century, ladies and gentlemen, under Omar al-Bashir's regime, the state instituted radical Islamization policies alongside the Unregistered Land Act. The outcome of this was that the non-Arab, non-Muslim indigenous groups in South Sudan, the Nuba Mountains, and Darfur were declared unregistered occupants of their ancestral lands. Millions of indigenous Africans were displaced from all rich and fertile regions, leading to the creation of paramilitary forces such as the Janjaweed to clear native populations for state and foreign agro-investors. Now let's go to Mauritania. Mechanism was a Cha-Bouba war, racial caste structures, and modern land reform laws. The historical impact of this was that following the 17th century conquest of the region by Arab tribes, a rigid racial hierarchy was codified. The Bidan elites, they placed themselves at the top, while indigenous black populations and Afro-Mauritanian ethnic groups, the Fulani, the Soninke, the Wolof, were relegated to lower castes. Now, the outcome was that in 1983, the government passed land reform law, which abolished traditional communal land tenure used by Afro-Mauritanian farmers along the Senegal River Basin. Ancestral lands were declared state property and redistributed to Arab Berber elites. This culminated in the 1989 ethnic cleansings, where tens of thousands of Afro-Mauritanians were expelled to Senegal and Mali, stripping them of their citizenship and land rights. Now, Nigeria. The mechanism was a Sokoto Caliphate conquest. The historical impact of this was that the 1804 jihad led by Usman Dan Fodio overthrew indigenous Hausa rulers and established the Sokoto Caliphate. The indigenous political structures and land tenure systems across northern and central Nigeria were replaced with Islamic Emirates. The outcome was that lands were redistributed to Fulani military commanders and Islamic scholars, as Malams. Non-Muslim indigenous populations were relegated to tributary status or subjected to slave raids. In contemporary times, clashes in Nigeria's Middle Belt, that's Benue, Plateau, Southern Kaduna, reflect ongoing disputes over indigenous ancestral lands versus expanding pastoralist dominance under religious framing. Let me explain why the process involves destruction of identity and slavery. One is cultural erasure and lineage substitution. Lineage rewriting to gain political protection or tax relief under Islamic caliphates. Indigenous elites frequently adopted Arab genealogies, claiming descent from the Prophet's tribe. This eroded indigenous oral histories and severed their historical claims as the original inhabitants of the land. Then there was linguistic replacement. Native languages such as Coptic in Egypt, Nubian in Sudan, and Berber dialects across North Africa were systematically replaced by Arabic in administration, commerce, and daily life. Losing the native language decoupled communities from their traditional customary landlords. Another thing it did was legal justification for slavery. The slavers' pretext was what they used. Populations inside Dar al-Harb who resisted conversion or tributary status were legally vulnerable to captivity and enslavement. Then trans-Saharan and Eastern African slave trades. Millions of indigenous sub-Saharan Africans were captured, enslaved, and marched across the Sahara or the Red Sea. Enslavement directly stripped individuals of their personal identity, freedom, and connection to their homeland, providing the labor force that enriched ruling dynasties across the Middle East and North Africa. Then there was land dispossession as economic domination by declaring non-conforming indigenous people as infidels or secondary subjects, that's dhimmis. Legal systems effectively denied them through property rights. Ancestral communal lands were reclassified as state property or granted as land grants to military commanders, transforming indigenous owners into tenant farmers or displaced refugees on their own land. What do you think about this? Do let me know in the comment section below. Representing A2 is Flo. Thank you, and I'll see you in the next one.